Duda was not large enough to sound decisive to anyone unfamiliar with the Desert War, yet in Operation Crusader it became one of the small places on which a campaign could turn. It lay near the approaches to Tobruk, close to the ground where the garrison's breakout and the relieving forces' advance might finally meet. After days of armored loss, command panic, and scattered fighting around Sidi Rezeg, the battle had narrowed toward the practical question that mattered most. Could a corridor be opened and held? Duda mattered because it was part of that corridor. It was a local feature with operational consequences, a piece of ground where tactical violence could decide whether Tobruk remained isolated or began to breathe again. To understand Duda, it helps to step back from the image of sweeping tank columns and see how desert warfare often concentrated around modest rises, tracks, and defended points. A place did not have to be a town or fortress to matter. If it gave observation, controlled an approach, or formed part of a link between two forces, it became valuable. Duda was important because it sat in the zone between Tobruk's perimeter and the forces pushing westward from the frontier. Possession of the ground could help connect the breakout from inside the fortress with the New Zealand advance from outside. Losing it, or failing to secure it, could leave the relief effort hanging by a thread. By the time Duda came into focus, Operation Crusader had already passed through severe crisis. British armor had been worn down in repeated engagements, 5th South African Brigade had been destroyed, and Rommel's dash to the frontier had shaken 8th Army headquarters. Yet the offensive had not stopped. The decision to continue allowed the 2nd New Zealand Division to move westward, bringing organized infantry, artillery, engineers, and anti-tank strength into a battle where exhausted armored formations could no longer carry the whole burden. This was one of Crusader's essential transitions. The campaign remained an armored battle, but its survival increasingly depended on infantry that could seize and hold the right ground. The Tobruk garrison also had to play its part. From inside the perimeter, the defenders were pushing outward through Axis siege positions, trying to meet the force coming from the east and southeast. That effort required infantry, tanks, artillery, engineers, and careful timing. But timing was never easy in the desert. Reports were late, ground changed hands, and units that seemed close on a map might still be separated by enemy fire and broken terrain. Duda stood near the hinge of that effort. If the garrison and relieving force could meet there, or near there, the siege line would no longer be an unbroken ring. If they could not, Tobruk's isolation would continue despite all the sacrifice already spent. For the New Zealanders, Duda was part of a hard westward push through a battlefield already littered with warning signs. They were not entering fresh, empty ground. They were moving into a contested zone shaped by German and Italian positions, artillery fire, anti-tank defenses, and the aftershocks of recent armored fighting. Their advance required more than marching courage. It required coordination between infantry battalions, supporting guns, anti-tank weapons, and transport. Once ground was taken, it had to be organized quickly against counterattack. In a fluid armored campaign, infantry success could be temporary unless it was immediately turned into a defensive system strong enough to survive the enemy's reaction. The fight for Duda was therefore not simply a matter of reaching a point on the map. It was a matter of making that point usable. Infantry had to occupy the ground, dig in where possible, place anti-tank guns to cover likely approaches, and connect with artillery support. Signals had to keep units in contact, even as confusion and enemy action interfered. Tanks could help, but tanks alone could not guarantee possession. This was a recurring lesson of Crusader. A vehicle might cross ground quickly, but holding that ground against counterattack required men, guns, ammunition, communication, and the discipline to turn a captured position into a defended one before the enemy returned. Axis resistance around the Tobruk corridor was determined because the stakes were obvious. If the Allies opened and held a link to Tobruk, Rommel's siege would be compromised. and the Axis position in eastern Libya would become much harder to sustain. German and Italian forces therefore had every reason to strike at any corridor that formed. The defenders of the siege line could use artillery, anti-tank guns, infantry posts, and mobile counterattacks to keep the Allied forces apart or to close the gap after contact. In this setting, Duda became more than a locality. It became one of the places where the Axis effort to preserve the siege met the Allied effort to break it. The tactical violence around such ground could be intense and confusing. Infantry might take a position under fire and then immediately face shelling or counterattack. Anti-tank gunners had to sight their weapons quickly, often in exposed conditions, because enemy armor could appear before a defense was properly settled. Artillery observers had to identify targets across dust, smoke, and shifting front lines. Commanders had to decide whether to push farther, consolidate, or redirect support to another crisis. The battlefield did not pause to let success become secure. At Duda, as elsewhere in Crusader, the difference between victory and failure could be measured in whether a position was held through the next enemy blow. This is why Duda's importance cannot be understood only through the language of capture. Capturing ground was one phase, holding it was another, linking it to a wider corridor was another still. For Tobruk to be relieved, the Allies needed a living connection, not a temporary overlap of patrols or a momentary crossing of paths. Supplies, troops, wounded men, guns, and command arrangements all needed a route that could function under fire. Duda helped make that possible because it formed part of the chain of ground connecting the breakout and the relief force. A corridor is only as strong as its most vulnerable points, and every vulnerable point draws enemy attention. The New Zealand role at Duda also shows how Commonwealth infantry shaped an operation often remembered through British armor and Rommel's Panzers. New Zealand units brought cohesion at a moment when the campaign badly needed it. Their actions did not erase the losses suffered by armored brigades, nor did they make the Axis army harmless, but they showed that disciplined infantry, properly supported, could change the balance in a tank war by holding ground armor had failed to stabilize. This is not a contradiction. It is the essence of combined arms warfare. Tanks create movement and shock, but infantry and guns often determine whether the result lasts beyond the first rush. For Rommel, the Allied grip on places like Duda created a serious problem. His earlier dash to the frontier had alarmed British headquarters, but it had also drawn attention and strength away from the most decisive ground near Tobruk. Now the British and Commonwealth forces were still pressing the corridor, and the garrison was still pushing outward. Rommel's army could counterattack, but it also had to deal with the cumulative strain of days of fighting, supply pressure, and losses of its own. The Axis position was not collapsing everywhere, but the siege was no longer secure in the way it had been. Duda represented that change in local, physical form. The human experience of Duda was far removed from the clean lines of operational history. Soldiers fought over ground that might look unimpressive to anyone seeing it in peacetime, but under fire it became everything. A low rise, a track, a defensive post, or an anti-tank gun position could determine whether men lived, whether units connected, and whether the siege line opened. The soundscape would have been engines, shells, small arms fire, shouted orders, and the difficult silence that comes when men wait for the next attack. It is important not to romanticize this. The importance of Duda was purchased through exhaustion, fear, wounds, and the loss of soldiers whose names do not always survive in campaign summaries. Duda also helps explain one of Operation Crusader's central themes. Nothing stayed won for long. Contact could be made and then lost. Ground could be taken and then contested again. A corridor could open, narrow, close, and reopen, as formations fought over its edges. This uncertainty was not evidence that the soldiers did not understand the mission. It was evidence that modern mobile battle had become too fluid for simple declarations of success. The same mobility that allowed the relief force to reach toward Tobruk also allowed the enemy to strike at the connection. Duda mattered because it sat inside that unstable space between breakthrough and security. In the larger history of armored warfare, Duda reminds us that the decisive point is not always the largest battle or the most famous tank clash. Sometimes it is the small piece of ground where a campaign's separate efforts finally touch. Operation Crusader was built around the idea of relieving Tobruk, but that idea had to become real through places like Duda, held by infantry, covered by guns, threatened by armor, and contested hour by hour. The episode belongs in this series because it shows armored warfare at its most integrated and unforgiving. Tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, supply, and command all had to serve one simple but difficult purpose: make contact, keep contact, and turn a fragile opening into a corridor that could survive.